The circumstances surrounding the tragic death of 31-year-old Savita Halappanavar has put Ireland in the world spotlight this week. As there is an ongoing investigation into her death, we cannot get into the details of this particular case until all the facts are known. But it has brought the issue of abortion and lack of legislation in this country into sharp focus. So joining me to discuss this tonight are Caroline Simons, lawyer for the Pro-Life campaign. Sean O'Donnell is a consultant psychiatrist and member of the Life Institute. Claire Daly is an independent TD in Dáil Éireann, and Simon Mills is a barrister, but also formerly a GP. And before we start, we do want to wish to express our sympathies on the death of Savita to her husband and family. We feel it's important and appropriate to say that this evening. Claire, we're going to begin with you, if I may, Claire Daly. We had a constitutional referendum in 1983, a Supreme Court judgment on the X case, a European Court ruling, an all-party Oireachtas Committee report, green papers, expert groups. It seems to be clear that politicians are incapable of dealing with this issue. And maybe it just should be left to the medical profession to deal with it. Would this be apparent to you?
I would totally agree with you, and unfortunately it's precisely because we had the 8th Amendment inserted in the Constitution that it has become a matter for the lawmakers and the politicians, and I think it's undoubtedly the case that the only reason why this issue hasn't been dealt with before now is purely and utterly because of political cowardice. We've had 2 referenda on it. People have spoken with clarity that they fully support the Supreme Court ruling where abortion should be available where a woman's life is in danger, and yet no legislation has been put in place in order to give that. To me, it's purely and utterly because of political cowardice.
Why would anyone be cowardly about this?
I think probably traditionally in the past they probably felt that with the links with the church and state there was probably a view that it was politically unpopular thing to do, that it might be a vote loser to tackle a controversial subject. But the reality is Irish society has moved on massively. There have been over 150,000 women have travelled over the past 30 decades to have abortions outside of this country. We've seen it in the outpouring of protest and concern over the case in Galway, where thousands of people have come out on the streets and expressed their concern that there needs to be something done on this.
Caroline, is it time?
Ryan, first I'd like to reiterate what you have just said, our commiserations. There isn't one single person in this audience or in this country who hasn't been deeply, deeply shocked, deeply worried, and who might now be very afraid about what treatment they're entitled to when they're pregnant. And I'd like to just add also my sympathy to the family of Rory Staunton in New York, who has had a similar experience. He went to hospital with a stomachache. 3 days later, he died of sepsis, and his case is being investigated. It's being discussed in Johns Hopkins this month and in New York Hospital last month.
Let's talk about the legislation as per Claire's response. Yeah. Maybe you'd tell us about what you think she just said.
I think one of the things I've noticed over the last week, I've been very appreciative of the cool head which Minister Riley has maintained this week, and of Enda Kenny's. There's no indication that they're going to rush to do anything. And I think if we're to be honest about this, Ryan, if there was a poll tomorrow, I think people would say yes to absolutely anything if they thought that anything would have saved Savita Halappanavar's life in this awful case in Galway. So I think one of the things we must always remember is this was a case that concerned management of miscarriage. We won't go into it. I do want to say this.
Do you know I've asked you at the very beginning not to go about this case. And if you do that, I'm just going to move the conversation on.
I'm not talking about it, but I'm going to say this.
Please don't.
There are over 10,000, 14,000 miscarriages in Ireland every single year. Miscarriages occurred before the 1983 referendum, before the X case was ever decided.
Is it time to legislate in this country to stop this grey area, this 20 years on we're waiting, it seems, for legislation? Is it time?
Ryan, if you've been following, and I know you have been following the newspapers' reports this week, we'll have seen many reports of Paul Cullen and other people showing that obstetricians knew what was required in a case like this. They do. Obstetricians in this country are all members of the Royal College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists. They have got their own guidelines, and they have got very particular guidelines in relation to the management of sepsis, because in England, in a period of 3 years, 5 women died of sepsis. So there are very particular guidelines out there which are known to all the obstetricians.
There are medical guidelines, Simon Mills, that'll suffice. Thank you very much.
You asked a 2-part question at the beginning, Ryan.
Okay.
Is it time for the politicians to do anything, or is it time to let the doctors take over?
Right.
Answer the first part first.
Sure.
In 1983, there was a referendum and the referendum said, we are going to create a scenario where there is an equal right to be shared, a right to life to be shared between the mother and the unborn child. It was clear in 1983 that that did not deal with the question of what happened when there was a conflict. It was clear in 1983 that legislation was necessary to set out what happened. Successive governments did nothing. In 1992, the Supreme Court said, look, we're going to rule on the specific facts of this specific case, and we're going to carve out a single exception. But we want to be clear. Mr. Justice Niall McCarthy, the late Mr. Justice Niall McCarthy, was very clear. The government must legislate on this. Another 20 years elapses. Now, I have to say something, that we've seen it in the Quinn case recently. If the Supreme Court or the High Court tell an ordinary citizen to do something, and they don't do it, they get sent to jail. When the people in 1983 and when the Supreme Court in 1992 tell the government to do something, they just ignore them.
Sean O'Donnell, do you think that the people deserve to be ignored by a government for 20 years, as per Simon's argument?
Well, I suppose I have a different perspective on it.
Sure.
The Supreme Court ruling of 1992 is quite clear in its findings, but at the same time we've had the experience of 20 years of lack of activity by the politicians in the legislative area. And what we've seen over that 20 years is that the absence of legal abortion in Ireland is not leading to the deaths of women. Now that's quite clear. And it's reassuring. I mean, if you go back 20 years to 1992, there was a statement issued in April of that year by the professors of obstetrics and gynecology from all the main universities in the country at the time, saying that there were no medical conditions which required direct intentional destruction of the unborn child. Now, that was in 1992. In 20 years, have we gone backwards? Has medical science advanced? Well, the obvious answer is that it's advanced. And the proof is there in our maternal mortality figures, which show that throughout the world, consistently, over the last 30, 40 years, with an absolute ban on abortion, Ireland has remained one of the safest places to have
I'm going to bring
a pregnancy or to have a baby.
Caroline, Simon. Claire, go.
Yeah, I think that's absolute and utter nonsense. Ireland's maternal mortality rate is high, and it's good. We're right up at the top of the list, along with other countries which have abortion. So the fact that we don't have abortion is not making things safer for women. It's a complete and utter irrelevancy. And the only reason why there haven't been more fatalities because of the failure of governments to legislate for this is because of the proximity of Britain. Thousands of women every year taking the boat. Many of them we know, we've heard them on the airwaves in the course of the week on the advice of their doctor, who said, I'm sorry, but I can't treat you here because of the lack of legal clarity. I'm afraid if your pregnancy continues, your life is in danger, and the only way for you to deal with that is to leave the country. So had we not got that safety valve, more people would have died.
No, Caroline, Claire's calling it a safety valve. Other people have said we're exporting a domestic problem. Other people say it's an Irish solution to an Irish problem. Either way, not on our front doorstep.
Well, I think the first thing I have to say in relation to what Simon has just said is, if you have a look at what our Constitution says, there is an inbuilt appreciation in the right to life section, which shows that it is not always practicable to defend and vindicate the life of the unborn. And doctors in this country do always look after the mother as a priority. If they can save a baby, that's a good thing, but they can't always do it. And they have to make judgment calls, and they have to have the freedom and the space in critical situations to make a judgment call that can involve terminating a pregnancy. That's legal, and it's ethical, and it's done all the time. And I am not alone in this country as having been a mother who has been the beneficiary of critical decisions like that. Otherwise, I would be a statistic died in childbirth. So, I'm very thankful for the standard of medical care that we have here. And I think we have to be really clear about what we're talking about. I mean, if you look at the bill that Claire introduced earlier this year, she's not talking about cases where mother's life, our lives are at risk. And I think we have to appreciate, Claire, you and I have had this debate before, and you have said that you think that as a reproductive choice and as a matter of personal autonomy, a woman should be entitled to choose to have an abortion for whatever reason she wants throughout pregnancy. And I think we have to be very clear, that being the case, I think we need to reflect very carefully. I'm very glad that the Minister and the Taoiseach have decided not to rush into anything in view of where we are this week.
Okay,
Because
Claire,
as I've
you
said,
right to reply.
Yeah, I mean,
Inigo.
obviously, that is, I do support a pro-choice position, but the legislation I introduced, and I was quite open about it, could only deal with the very narrow specifics of providing for abortion in Ireland where the life of a woman was in danger. So, that was the restrictive nature of that. I was actually apologetic that it was so restrictive, but to say that it opened the floodgates and would allow unlimited abortion is absolutely ludicrous, and it is reflective of the sort of hype and hysteria that surrounds this issue, which really we should be discussing quite calmly and rationally, because it affects so many
Let me ask
families.
you, Sean, do you see suicide, the threat of suicide, as a grounds for abortion if a woman is threatening to take her life?
No, I certainly don't.
You don't?
I don't, because it's not a reliable assessment. You may not know, but when a psychiatrist carries out a suicide assessment, their estimation is that they'll be correct in 2% of the cases. Now, that may be because subsequently they'll intervene and treat or admit a patient to hospital, but realistically, that's how poor it is. The X-case judgment in 1992 didn't use any medical personnel to carry out an assessment. No, it is true.
Claire's saying it's
quite
not
true.
true.
Oh, excuse me.
Is it true or not?
High
It's
Court,
quite
there was
true.
oral evidence given by a psychologist in that
By
case.
a psychologist.
Which is
and
not the
and in
same
20
as.
years of practicing, I have never come across a situation since the X case where an assessment of suicide was carried out by a psychologist.
So
And
do you
I've
reject
worked in
the
several
X-case
jurisdictions.
Supreme Court findings? Do you just feel it's unacceptable? Is that it?
No, I think that they should have sought the correct expert opinion. I mean, it really wasn't appropriate for to use a psychologist who specialised in sex therapy to assess a young girl as regards her suicidality. It would have made far more sense to bring in a child and adolescent psychiatrist. But as I say...
Would you have been happy to see a psychiatrist there, or would you still think that psychiatrists aren't going to get it right either?
No, I think that...
So who's going to get it right, in other words?
Well, you see, the problem here is that what Sean is saying is that not just is this case wrong, but there's never a threat of suicide. So I'm kind of,
No, my
else
point
would agree with that.
is very clear in terms of are there medical circumstances that require abortion to be made legal? And there was a symposium in Dublin in September. We had world experts in maternal fetal medicine who came over, and all of them, without fail, every single one of them signed a declaration. It's known as the Dublin Declaration. It's being shown all over the world, stating that there were no medical circumstances that required direct intentional legal abortion in order to treat the complications of
The first thing to
pregnancy.
say is that the symposium that's being relied on, the Dublin Declaration that's been relied on, was a symposium organised by pro-life organisations, featuring predominantly pro-life doctors, and with the aim of producing a
So not an
declaration that was essentially
independent
pro-life.
document or
Certainly,
nothing?
that's my assessment of
That's
the
your
personnel
assessment.
involved
It's
and
not
the
actually-
documents
it's not
involved.
accurate. It's not accurate.
It certainly did not strike me as, on reading either the document or the papers that were presented or the names of the personnel involved, as being a broad spectrum representation of Irish medical practice or even international
I
medical
want Simon
practice.
to finish. You
But
can come
there
back in a
is-
second,
it's-
Sean.
yeah.
Let Simon finish the point.
There is an important observation to make. We're dealing here with two of the most significant rights, I think, that can exist. As Claire has, I think, been unfairly characterised by Caroline as talking about the right of autonomy, it is an incredibly important right within the Constitution. The other important right is the right to life, and in particular a clash between rights to life, those of the unborn on one hand, the pregnant woman on the other. We have a situation where these incredibly complex rights are managed by a single sentence in the Constitution, a single paragraph in a complex judgment on a specific set of facts. And you asked the question earlier on, are we okay leaving this to the medical professions? It's also managed by guidelines promulgated by the Irish Medical Council. This is true, but they can be changed tomorrow. There is no other area of Irish law involving such essential rights that is governed by so little certainty, by so little law, and by so little
I'd like to
by
bring-
the citizens.
Listen to
I
what
come
Simon
back
saying.
on
The
that?
lack of
Because-
certainty is something that has really been thrown up this
And the
week. This is what people
Medical
are talking about
Council-
in their
and the Medical Council have
over
addressed
their
this.
cup of tea in the morning and in back
And
in
the
the
Medical
bus.
Council have addressed this very clearly. And for Simon to say that the Medical Council could turn around tomorrow morning and change the ethics, that's not true. The last set of guidelines in relation to the treatment of women with complication pregnancy took over 12 months to produce. It brought in experts from from every field of medicine
But
and
wouldn't
obstetrics, so
legislation
on.
stop even that element of uncertainty from
And
happening? Carol, I want you to come
And
in
we
here
need
now.
the clarity.
I'll come back to you in a
We
second.
need that clarity that
Yeah,
the
I
medical
appreciate
council
that.
have provided.
Yeah, well, that's what we're talking about. Absolutely, yes, Carol.
I was just going to say, and it has nothing to do with abortion, a book I read a number of years ago by a surgeon was called Complications, A Surgeon's Guide to an Inexact Science. And I think everybody listening knows that no matter what you go to a hospital for, once you go through a hospital door with anything, any complaint at all, there are always risks. And that is the fact of the matter. And I think that we should appreciate this. I've spoken to doctors about this over very many years. And of course, in the 20 years we've been talking about this, Ryan, we've talked about whether legislation is the way to go, whereby there would be a list of all the complications that could exist for which doctors may feel there's a grey area and they don't know what to do. Now, the fact of the matter is, doctors have said over very many years, and they've been saying in the paper this week, if one would give them space to see what they're saying, they need space to make critical judgments themselves. You start listing complications, you leave things out. There'll be facets of complications that aren't dealt with, and you will find that the doctors will be far more hog-tied by having to look at sections and provisions and articles, and women's lives will be put at risk because you're making the thing. You can't make medicine so legalistic.
Claire,
You see,
the legalistic nature of medicine, they're not, the twain shouldn't and can't
Caroline,
meet.
it's quite correct that medical judgments require deliberation. They require medical expertise, and that's why many countries deal with the issue of abortion not in their constitution. The problem here for doctors is that this medical decision that they are making is also affected by the Offences Against the Person Act, where if they are found guilty of assisting or carrying out an abortion on somebody, they would be open to penal servitude for life.
This law was enacted in what year?
1861. So that is background legislation. The Constitution says they must carry out this balancing act between the life of the mother and the life of the unborn without any criteria whatsoever, but with the possibility of some serious criminal charges being brought against them should they make a genuine mistake.
Doctors' hands
they
are
need
tied.
clarity.
They need clarity. They have a legal case coming down at them if something goes wrong.
The biggest mistake, in fact, that we'd probably make would be to tie their hands with legislation. The 1861 Act hasn't been used, let's face it, it's there in the background. It's, if you like, it's the piece of legislation that protects the unborn child. But when it comes down to the conflict between the right to life of the mother, the right to life of the child, where that comes down, the Medical Council comes down very, very clearly on the side of the mother. And as Professor Fionnuala McAuliffe, who's the head of the Institute of Obstetricians and Gynecologists, stated quite clearly, there is no confusion amongst obstetricians as to what to do in this situation. The mother's life must be preserved, regardless of what that results in. Every effort will be made to keep the mother safe and well. And if that involves the early delivery of a child, and the child unfortunately dies, and let's face it, probably the most unhappy person in that situation will be the mother herself. But if that's the situation, so be it.
What about the circumstances? Now, I want to ask you, if a woman has been diagnosed with a pregnancy where the baby will not survive,
I've delivered a child
outside, will not survive outside the womb. I've spoken to women on this show
who
who had to find themselves on an aeroplane to go across the water to land somewhere else to get this operation, this termination. Do you think it's time that these women were allowed some element of choice in their life to do something so awful for them? These women were upset, they were grieved. Should they not be allowed to just do that in the comfort of their own city, their home, their country? Or not? Do you say get on the plane and go? Well, like, I'm not trying to be emotive about it, but I do want to ask you what you think.
I think, Ryan, that's, I have close friends who've gone through this. It is a tragic situation, and I'm going to defer to the doctor who's here in relation to how it's best managed. But I would say this to you.
The doctor being?
The doctor here being...
Which?
Well, there's one doctor on the panel. Oh, sorry, there are two.
You see, we probably get
Simon
two
is a
different
barrister.
answers,
I know.
you see.
No, but what I was going to say to you is this. You're going into an area that goes beyond what the Supreme Court dealt with and has decided. And if you want to have abortions available in that situation, you're going to have to ask the Irish people.
But I'll ask you as an Irish
You're going
woman,
to have to have
what's
a
your
referendum.
answer?
I have not been persuaded yet
So you're
that
saying
is
no.
the best way to manage
Okay.
a situation when the fetus when you've been told the fetus won't survive to birth or for long afterwards. And I would encourage people who think that I'm being, difficult about this. I trust the doctors. Please look at 99 Balloons on YouTube. Look at Elliot Hartman-Mooney's case, which covers exactly this.
You've asked the two people a straight question. You got no sort of straight answer out of Dr. O'Donnell. You got eventually some sort of straight-ish answer out of Caroline Simons. The answer you got from Sean O'Donnell is a preposterous one. It doesn't inform that I have delivered a baby with significant disabilities. That tells us nothing about
had a chance.
it. Tells us
I haven't
nothing
had a chance to continue
about the view. But in my view, in a situation where there is a lethal fetal abnormality, that is one of the grounds. And it's also important to remember...
One of the grounds.
I think that should be one of the grounds on which a person can request a termination within this state. And I think that's one of the problems as well with the focus on the X case, is that it's an assumption that is all there is to be said in the difficult world of maternal fetal medicine. It isn't. It's one decision on one particular set of facts against a constitutional provision that balances rights. There are so many aspects in which we need to balance those rights.
Is there anyone in the audience who wants to make a comment? Gentleman here with the glasses, just bear with us. Your name is?
My name is Sean Rooney, and I would like to tell my story. Mine is a story without a beginning. I was born in 1992 in the midst of what the state witnessed was the greatest abortion debate we've ever had. I was born 2 weeks after the referenda that enshrined in our constitution the right to travel and the right to pro-information. I was born about 6 months after the X case, and I was adopted, and I'm pro-choice.
You're pro-choice. Okay.
I was brought into my... sorry, can I finish?
Yeah, you have to be quite quick.
Yeah,
I'm sorry, I know it's a
understand.
long story, but honestly, we're very short in time.
What I say, I think it's about time that we took this out of the political sphere and we trusted that the conversation should be between women and their doctors and not in the House.
That's your point. Somebody from the other side of the argument, yes?
I would like to say that I think I was glad to see that you weren't discussing Savita's case tonight, because I think what we have seen in the past 2 days in this country has been an extraordinary amount of scaremongering. Yeah. I think Irish women who are watching this programme at home should be assured that they are safe in Irish maternity hospitals, and that our pro-life laws ensure that both they and their babies are safe, and that we have one of the lowest maternal mortality rates in the world precisely because of that.
Okay, I'll take it, lady, again. You might tell us if you are on one side of the argument. Actually, we'll hold on. Simon, you want to come in? Excuse me. Sorry.
This has been, Caroline said this earlier on, and maybe it was Sean, that questioner just said it. David Quinn had a whole article about it today. The thesis that we have a low mortality rate precisely because of our abortion laws. And this keeps being said.
Yes.
Just want to point out one simple thing. The country in Europe with the lowest maternal mortality rate is Italy, and it permits abortion. The presence or otherwise of a low mortality rate tells us absolutely nothing about the role of abortion.
Okay, so you're
preserving that.
One thing it does, though, it gives you no justification whatever to suggest that because we don't have abortion, that mothers are dying. So if it's the case that you can't have your cake and eat it. No, you can't have your cake and eat it. If you look at the statistics in England, the basis on which people are having abortions, Claire, let's be honest, it is not because their lives are at risk. Look at the statistics.
And the statistics are readily available, because the beautiful thing about Britain, and this may sound preposterous to Simon as well, but the beauty of Britain is that they actually keep very close statistics. If you pick up the phone and ring the Office of Population Census and Surveys, they can give you all the relevant statistics into exactly what happens in relation to the number of women who give Irish addresses, which we're constantly reminded of, and also they have the confidential inquiry into maternal deaths.
And your point being?
And we're copying it here. The importance being that if all of these people that Claire believes are travelling over there to terminate pregnancies because they're at such high risk.
That. I've never said that.
You just said it there.
Not because
at
their
such
life
high
is in
risk.
danger. There's all sorts of different reasons.
That was what you indicated. But the reality is,
she's denying she indicated that.
I know that.
She feels you're misreading her point.
Yeah, and Simon felt that Simon misread my point. But anyway, the point is.
Would you just finish your point and make it, because I'm not being because we've got about a minute left.
People keep on cutting in, so
go for it.
Okay, the point is that if it was a significant problem, the NHS and the British government would turn around to us and say, look, stop sending us your problems.
That is almost the most ridiculous argument I've heard in a week of ridiculous arguments. the idea that, in fact, one of the best, and I think it's not unfair to say, noble health services would turn around to us and say, you've been exporting your problem to us and we've been looking after it. But you know what? We've had enough.
One of the best
We're not
and
the
noble,
NHS anymore.
most
We're
noble
not
health
everything the
services.
NHS stands for. Take your problem back and
One
deal
of
it with
the best
yourself.
and most
That
noble
might
health
actually
services
be a good thing to
is
do, because then
currently-
finally the government would get its
currently
act in
terminating
gear,
100
do what the people have told it to do, and do what the Supreme Court has told it to do.
Okay, we're out of time. The Taoiseach has said that the expert group's report will be published. What are you expecting, Caroline?
I don't know what I'm expecting. As I said, I'm glad that cool heads are prevailing and he's not rushing into anything. And I think the one message that must go out, that the doctors of the country are concerned women know, is that Irish women are not being let die because of lack of intervention in their pregnancies, and they will continue to be looked
The
after.
Committee on the Constitution indicated very clearly that the absence of legal abortion was not causing problems in relation to complicated pregnancies.
I'm not expecting much when I hear Enda Kenny talking about not being rushed into anything after 30 years, but what I will guarantee him is that we are not prepared to wait. I will be re-entering our bill to provide for legislation to take account of the X case, and I think that thousands of people will be on the streets tomorrow in Dublin at the Gardner Remembrance from 4 o'clock. We'll be telling him the same, because people are not willing to put up with it anymore.
I hope that humanity and compliance with the law doesn't prove too much to ask for.
Thank you all for coming in to us this evening. Appreciate your time. Ladies and gentlemen, our panel and discussion. Thank you.